Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me very well? Yeah, thank you. For the people here in the pavilion, in the Dutch IUCN Pavilion. And welcome to the people listening in on the YouTube channel. From the Netherlands, from Europe, wherever you are, from worldwide. Thank you, and hope you enjoy the session. Well, it would be good to explain to you that you can use the chat in the YouTube to ask your questions to the speakers. So please use the YouTube chat for questions. And people in the audience here, you can directly ask a question here. Today we have a session on nature-based solutions, on natural climate buffers, with some very nice examples from the Netherlands situation, the Dutch situation. We have 4 speakers. Afterwards, we have a little discussion about the European ambitions and ambitions we have in fighting against all the different elements and climate change effects which happen right now. You might have seen all the floodings worldwide. In Europe, for example, we had floodings in more than 12 countries in the last 2 months only, with devastating effects, Belgium, the Netherlands. And working on nature-based solutions is a very good way of trying to minimize the impacts of these damages. Well, my name is Harm Schoten. I work for Eurocide. Eurocide is the European Organization of Nature Conservation members. And we have 75 members in 24 member states. And what we do is we try to improve nature conservation, to support site managers with being able to do a good job in the field and trying to support the EU biodiversity strategy, the global biodiversity strategy, the climate change adaptation and mitigation. And we have 8 working groups within Eurocide, for example, agriculture, on peatlands restoration. And we have 1 working group on wetlands and climate change, which is directly focusing on raising awareness for natural climate buffers and nature-based solutions. I hope you enjoy today's session. We will start our discussion. Can I have the slide with the program, please? As I said, we have 4 presentations. We will start with an explanation from a Dutch perspective. So we organized this workshop together with the Dutch Nature Climate Buffer Coalition, a coalition of nature organizations who try to work on natural climate buffers in a very practical manner. And we will start the discussion and the presentation by Jeffrey Brandt from the BirdLife the Netherlands. And he's immediately followed by Paul Vettergaal. They are both experts on natural climate buffers. And well, let's start. And I hope you enjoyed the sessions. If you have questions, please ask them in the chat or directly after this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, thank you, Harm, for the introduction. My name is Jeffrey. I work for BirdLife Netherlands, as Harm has just announced, and I'm going to talk you through a small introduction on natural climate buffers. If you could proceed to the next slide, please. And I'm going to show you a bit what we mean with a multiple benefit approach. Next slide. Well, I'm going to start in on a very cheerful note. No, I'm kidding. I'm going to skip through these slides very quickly because I'm probably saying things that you already know. But we're in the midst of a biodiversity crisis. For example, the last 25 years, we've lost 75% of insect populations. We all know the Living Planet Index graphs showing steady declines since 1970. Next slide. And at the same time, we're also finding ourselves in the middle of a climate crisis. We find heat record after heat record. We see more and more forest fires, for example, in the south of Europe. And actually, this picture here has been taken in the south of the Netherlands only a few weeks ago. Next slide. And this was a headline that I found in one of the bigger newspapers. Climate and nature crisis, solve both or solve neither, as experts say. And this is actually the starting point of this whole natural climate buffer story that I'm about to share with you. Next slide. Natural climate buffers are defined as places where natural processes are given space and where benefits are created for both nature and people. We do this by working in a coalition. It's a coalition of the 8 major nature organizations in the Netherlands, of which BirdLife Netherlands and Natuurmonumenten, for my colleague Paul, are a part of. Next slide. And we are financially supported by the LIFE IP program. And this whole natural climate buffer story is basically stooled on 2 different principles. The first one is the principle of ecosystem services, which means that we are really trying to tell the story of how a natural climate buffer gains, well, literally multiple benefits. So not only for high water safety, for example, but it has a lot of other benefits that come across. And these benefits, we call them ecosystem services, but I will go into a bit more detail later. Next, yeah. And the second principle is an integrative approach, because we do not focus on nature or protected areas per se, but rather on the areas that surround them. Because we want to create buffer areas that, for example, intensive agriculture is buffered by such a natural climate buffer so that the protected area can stay healthy. Next. And we've done this over the last couple of years. We've had a quite successful pilot phase, I can say. Here on this map, you can see the Netherlands. Everything in blue are the most important climate buffer projects that have been finished. And in yellow, you see the ones that are still in progress. And maybe good to, just accent a little bit. We see them all over the country. So of course, we have along the coastline a lot of coast-related, high water safety-related natural climate buffers, but also along the major rivers, we have different type of climate buffers. And also in peatlands, we do a lot of peat restoration, etc. Well, I'm going to talk you through that in a minute. Next slide. These multiple benefits and these ecosystem services and the combination with the integrative approach have been translated into 6 different categories of natural climate buffers. These are biobuilders, carbon sink, green air conditioning, natural sponge, living coast, and green and blue space. You don't have to remember them. I'm going to take you by the hand and walk you through the 6 different categories in a minute. Next slide, please. And of course, natural climate buffers are part of the nature-based solutions family that IUCN has done a lot of important work on. Next slide. During this pilot phase, we have seen results that actually nature-based approaches can be very beneficial compared to technological approaches. Next. Firstly, they turn out to be smarter because technological approaches often have a one-dimensional purpose. For example, in the Netherlands, we are internationally famed for our fight against water. You know, if there's the water level is rising, we just build a higher dike. But actually, that is just a very multi-dimensional, single-dimensional approach. We just use it for high water safety, and in the end, no one really wants to look at a very high dike in front of their house. If you use nature-based solutions, we can actually give these natural processes that play here more space, and well, we have a lot more ecosystem services that we suddenly see in the area. Next. They can actually be cheaper. We have found in our pilot projects that nature-based solutions, natural climate buffers, can be up to 50% cheaper than technological solutions. And of course, the Netherlands is one of the countries in the world with the highest ground prices. So you can only imagine that outside of the Netherlands, this would even be, the benefit will be even greater than this. Next. They are, of course, prettier. Just as I mentioned, we'd rather see a spacious nature area than look at a very high dike that blocks all the vision from our house. Next. They are, in the end, more sustainable because, for example, sea level will keep rising for the coming years, which means that we have to rebuild our dikes every now and then. But if we just give these natural processes space and build natural climate buffers that can grow along with a changing climate, that is, of course, more sustainable in the long run. Next. And with these natural climate buffers, we believe during this pilot phase that we have really demonstrated an answer to both of these crises that I just mentioned at the beginning of my talk. Next. I'm now going to talk you through the 6 different categories of natural climate buffers that we have defined. And if you want, we also have some fact sheets lying there in the back. And for the people at home, you can find them at our website. Next. The first one being Biobuilders. What you see here is a picture taken by my colleague Paul, who was in the Waddensee last week. This is you can see a zoomed in picture over there. It is seagrass that we are looking at. And seagrass is categorized as a biobuilder by the Coalition on Natural Climate Buffers. What you see here is a terrace of seagrass that has actually been trapping sediment. So the sea level is actually growing along with sea level rise. An example of a biobuilder natural climate buffer. Next. Well, seagrass also has a bit of overlap with this one, but there's also peatland, a carbon sink, a very important climate mitigating buffer. Because what it does, of course, peatland is a huge potential emitter of greenhouse gases. In the Netherlands, it is estimated that the entire emission of peatland that is drying out, in fact, because of the artificially low groundwater levels, is emitting about the same as 2 or 3 coal factories. So this is really big amounts that we're talking about here. So we're trying to re-wet the peat. Yes, next slide, please. Green and blue space is a high water safety measure where we actually use, for example, floodplains along rivers to let rivers naturally overflow and give the water the space to overflow, which in turn also brings back some returns because there's rich sediment sinking down in these floodplains, making it more feasible to have some seasonal agriculture, for example. Next. Green air conditioning. I think we all understand that if you sit under a tree, you will be less hot than if you sit in on a brick bench in a brick street in the middle of the street. So the more vegetation we plant in parks, the cooler it gets. So this is a measure against heat stress. Yes, next. Living coast. As I mentioned a couple of times now, we can keep rebuilding our dikes, but we can also give space to natural processes in the dune area of our country and let the dunes protect us from the higher sea level. Yes, next. Then we have a natural sponge. And the idea here is that when rain falls, we want to keep the water in the capillaries of river systems for as long as possible and to avoid very high peak runoffs so that we keep the ground wet and then we just gradually can release the water into the river so that we do not have the problem of such inundations and evacuations potentially of people. And some of these natural climate buffers will also be touched upon by later speakers today. Paul is going to speak to you about the Onlanden case in the Netherlands, which is a combination of this natural sponge, a carbon sink, and also green-blue space. We have Jos de Bijl, who will talk on behalf of Wetlands International, saying some more on the natural sponge. And we have Glen Swainson from Natural England talking about carbon sinks. And this was my last slide on the introduction of natural climate buffers. So I now give the floor to Paul, who will take you by the hand and give you a bit more detail on what we've done in the north of the Netherlands on realizing a green-blue space, a carbon sink, and a natural sponge.
Am I understandable for you? Okay. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. I'll continue our common presentation. Can you give the next slide, please? I'll tell you, well, you have seen the map in one of the first slides Jeffrey showed. And we have a lot of examples and a lot of pilots of natural climate buffer projects in the Netherlands, which we do together with the local water boards and etc. I just pick out one, and it's one of the biggest. It is type natural sponge mainly. It is in, can you give the next one? This is on the map. You can see the Netherlands, and then in the northern part of the Netherlands, this area is situated at the edge of the city of Groningen, which is a city of about 250,000 inhabitants, a provincial capital, and that area was threatened years and years by heavy rainfall and floods organized by that. The next one, please. And to cope that, nature organizations tried to convince water authorities that giving water space together with a nature which wants to live there would be the best solution. And after some lobby, the authorities started calculating, and they saw that creating an area of about 200 hectares, which are at the moment partly Ramsar and Nature 2000 area, could store about 10 million cubic meters water during a flooding, and that's a lot. The area with a red line, which is called onlanden, and that means bad land, and actually that's good land, we think. But it was difficult for farmers. That area could function as a water retention area. The costs were, well, it was all about a bit more than 14 million euros, but the alternative would be higher up the dikes around the city of Groningen, and that would have been about 155 million euros. So this was really a very cheap alternative, despite the fact that land is so expensive in the Netherlands. And it was very easy to make a combination of climate adaptation measures for the ecosystem use, stopping floods, and the biodiversity goals we have in that area and the Nature 2000 area and around. And we could enlarge the area with a lot of nature. In 2012, it wasn't opened yet formally, but then there was a huge rainfall period, and it was necessary to use it already, these areas. And after opening them, it was necessary to make a provisional opening in somewhere in a small dike around the area. And then in a shorter period than one day, the water level around and in the city of Groningen dropped with 30 to 40 centimeters. So it has proven it before its first opening day. Next slide, please. Well, of course, it is gains for biodiversity, a lot of marshland birds, which belong actually to the Dutch environment, and they exploded nearly. Also very rare bird species, but also insects and nearly extincted marshland mammals like the otter. They returned to this area in several. Yeah, next one, please. And it is because it's so close to the city. Onland is also an oasis for people who are have a need for leisure, fresh air, cool circumstances during summer, sport there. So it is very important leisure area. It is also an urban oasis. Next one. And at this moment, I told you already that the onlander can store now 10 million of cubic meters. the climate is still changing, and now the water authorities see that they need to find another 5 million cubic meters in that area. And at first they wanted to highen up the small dikes around the Onlander area. So around those 2,200 hectares. But then as the nature managers, they said, well, 10 years ago, 50 years ago, there was a reason to give water space to make a combination with biodiversity. If your climate adaptation needs are growing and you need to store more water, you have to enlarge this area. And so we think that you should use the adhering, bordering nature areas in the upstream area. So in this figure, that is south of the red line, you see blue areas. Those are small river valleys. Use those river valleys for biodiversity and nature. They are too dry now, and we will want to help you to adapt them to more water, so we can store the water in during rainfall, but we can also use that water for overcoming droughts in the area. And we are now discussing about this new plans. Next slide, please. Then the area will grow, nearly doubling. It will, of course, cost a lot of money again. We are now struggling with the water board, whether they want to use sluices and dikes to separate it from the intensive agriculture, and we say no. You have to give it space enough that that's not necessary. And one new ecosystem service which will be delivered by this area is re-wetting the peat. Jeffrey told about it, and we think that we can prevent a lot of emissions from drying peatland, which can change into carbon sequestrating peatland. Next slide, please. This was my story about the very short story about this case. If you want to read more, in the back of the pavilion, there is some information, and the fact sheets who are presented there you can find on the website. Maybe you can go back in the presentation. Is it impossible? And then the last one. You have to go the other direction. Up to the end. At the first URL, there is information about English language climate buffer fact sheets, also about Onlander, but also the other types. And at the second, in the second URL code, it is some additional sites, fact sheets on the Eurosite website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and Jeffrey, for a very good explanation and about the Dutch situation. I'm sure there are some questions, but considering the time, I want to propose to continue at this stage. And it's interesting to tell you that in the audience we have today the Ministry of Public Works from Suriname, who by accident we met today, and he is really interested in the topic because of the situation in Suriname. And I would like to invite him to come over to me and explain us a bit about the situation, say a few words about the situation in Suriname and what he thinks of, well, nature-based solutions. And his name is Riyad Nur Mohammed.
Yes, Yes, my name is Riyad Noor Mohammed, currently the Minister of Public Works in Suriname. And before that, I was working for 20 years at the University of Suriname. I'm here with my colleague. So I have been busy the last 10 years or more with indeed nature programs, research in the environment, etc. It's a big shift for me now as a Minister of Public Works, but definitely I'm taking the agenda of nature-based solutions within my policy. So one of the policies as a Minister of Public Works is not only building roads with concrete and asphalt, but also look if I can find other materials that do not harm the environment or causes less change in climate, for example. So we have seen the presentations, and I have to say that Suriname is like the Netherlands or other countries, low-lying areas. We have great difficulties with the impact of climate change, like floods and droughts are our major problems because they directly impact our ecosystems, because we have ecosystems very low-lying along the coast. So any change in sea level has a direct impact on the aquatic ecosystems. Any change in water level, for example, drought, changes the impact on movement of people, especially in the inland interior. So we have seen some examples, and we want to introduce more of these techniques in Suriname. So there is enough research possible. So if there are people interested to do research, to make plans, we have the possibilities. They can make contact perhaps through your organization, and then I will get the message. There have been some good initiatives. One of them very popular, nice initiative is solving coastal erosion using the methodology I saw here using quelders, where we build that with bamboo in the sea, and you get the slip, or I'm not sure what the English word is, and then finally we plant the mangroves, and that rehabilitates the ecosystem. We win a lot. The benefit is a lot because we have people working there. We have people living from the mangrove system. So that is a success story, and we want to extend that to other places instead of building very, very expensive concrete dikes, for example. That's one of the challenges of my ministry. A second very nice project is, well, we have not started with solutions yet, but almost 1/3 of Suriname, the rivers are polluted because of illegal mine activities. This is a major problem with our neighbor countries. So what we have done, we have put in place instruments that can monitor and provide us with real data to convince policy. They don't have to convince me because I don't, but to convince policymakers. But then starts the next step. What should be the next step? Are there methodologies to clean the rivers? Are there methodologies to rehabilitate the land? How are we going to rehabilitate or clean water that has been polluted? So that is the next step. So there are great challenges. We are a country with a lot of fresh water. We are a country with a lot of forests, but the reality is a little bit different. So nature-based solutions can be an opportunity for small scale, but also for large scale problems. Yep. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Noor Mohammed, for your clear story, and also for making the connection with research and nature-based solutions. Very helpful. Thank you. We will continue our presentations with a very interesting story from the Rhine area in Germany, which acts as a natural climate buffer sponge. And we're very happy that Jos de Bijl from Bureau Stroming, which is a kind of expert group on fluidal systems and river systems, will give a presentation on behalf also on Wetlands International and WWF. So I would like to ask Jos, who is the director of Bureau Stroming, to come in. He's coming in virtually. He's not present here in Marseille, but he's at home in the Netherlands. But he will explain the story about the Rhine.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me over there?
Yes, we can, and we see you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm very happy to be here. I cannot see my presentation at the moment, but yeah, thank you. Yeah, my name is Jos de Bel, and I'm here on behalf of Wetland International and WWF, and together we work on the restoration of micro-catchments and of natural retention in river catchments. In this particular case, the Rhine catchment, where we have in this upstream catchment areas, we are trying to make sure that we can restore the sponge capacity of these upstream areas. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, the problem definition, this is very, very quickly, we all know this, it's happening when we are watching outside, it's happening, the inevitable and irreversible climate change caused by our activity. And it has a huge impact on river catchments and river systems and all the people that living close to the river areas. As we saw last month, one and a half months ago in Germany and Belgium. Next slide, please. But at the same time, we have a biodiversity crisis, of course, also in the freshwater environment. It's declining, the biodiversity is declining faster in the freshwater areas than in the ocean and forest. And that's already worrying. So we have to bend the curve. And that's also one of the major goals, the global goals in freshwater ecosystems. Next slide, please. And then we ask ourselves the question, okay, how do micro-catchments fit in these global challenges? First of all, it's important to have a definition of micro-catchments. We talk about upstream catchment areas where a natural riverbed is formed by the power of the flowing water. That's the location where the river is starting. That are the capillaries of the river catchments. As you see in the picture on the left, we see the Rhine catchment area from the Alps all the way to the Netherlands. And the side river is the Moezel River, and the side river is the Prüm and the Kiel River. And there, in the upstream areas, the water is gathering and flowing downstream and causing there hopefully a lot of good things, but also flooding and maybe also droughts when there is no precipitation at all. Next slide, please. What do we see in these micro-catchment areas? In the picture below, you see a little tributary of the River Rhine in 1850, just 150 years ago. And the land use that was existing here was this kind of land use. It was a swampy area with little agriculture, just for the local market. There was some agriculture. But in this last 150 years, this same tributary became a very large tributary because of the transition in land use. And that's mainly agricultural transition, but also transition in building houses and roads. The discharge of the water systems enlarged. And what it caused is that water is leaving these upstream catchment areas quicker than ever before. And it's causing higher flood peaks and longer periods of droughts. In Holland, we have then a problem with the refilling of our groundwater table. That's because in the early days when there was not so much, when this small river was still small again, the rainwater gets the time to refill the groundwater level. But in this area, in this time, we get rid of the water fast, and the groundwater table is therefore getting lower and lower. At the same time, we have problems with the modification of natural river conditions, fertilization, pesticides, and that's causing river ecosystem degradation. Next slide, please. And here you see that also again in the south of the Netherlands, a tributary of the River Meuse. We see on one hand the river tributaries in 1850, and nowadays you see the drainage networks that's added to the river systems. Next slide, please. we did a small study, a sort of quick scan study in other European river catchments, all the way from the Iberian Peninsula to the northeast of Europe in the river Tisza, and in Poland in the river Oder. And we saw in all this type of river catchments, we saw the same pattern existing, that in these upstream areas, existing natural river systems were enlarged and coupled, and drainage systems were added to this small river catchments. So there lies also the solution to preserve water, to preserve rainwater there, and to slow it down from flowing downwards. Next slide, please. So what we are trying to do, what we're working on, is the restoration of the sponge areas in upstream catchment area. And on the left side, you see a river catchment which is enlarged by human activity. And on the left side, on the left side below, you see this after sponge restoration. And that means that we are giving these areas, these enlarged areas, back to nature again. On the right side, you see the principal drainage systems over here, an extended river catchment over there, and all the water which is flowing from the surrounded hills is leaving the catchment very fast. When we restore that and restore this, give back this area to the nature, to the natural circumstances, to the natural processes, it would more like be a swampy area, a small swampy area, which delays the water and prevent it from flowing downwards too quickly. Next one, please. Well, it looks, this is a picture from the German Eifel area where we were 2 years ago. And here you saw a peat restoration project where they just, very technical, simply just blocked the existing drainage channels in order to restore these peatland areas. And these peatland areas existed here because after the Second World War, a lot of forest was planted because they were in need of wood, but this forest couldn't bear this wet circumstances, so they dug all kind of drainage channels. In order to restore these peatland areas, they, on this pilot site in a nature area, they blocked the drainage channels. And what you see immediately happen is that the water is flowing through the peat from the existing rough vegetations in some kind of overland flow that is much slower and is able to restore this whole ecosystem. Next slide, please. Yeah, you see that also again. It's a very, they told us that the restoration of the ecology is taking a while before the whole system has its biodiversity back, but the hydrology is immediately working if you stop draining the area. Next slide, please. Well, the effectiveness of the sponges, they are existing in this high middle mountain areas because there the most of the precipitation is falling, and that's where we have to store the water at first if we want to prevent flood downstream. Next one, please. So we did also a modeling approach. We used different kind of models to make to look at the effectiveness of sponge restoration on different scales. So on micro scale catchments, in kind of bigger scales, and on macro scale, on what effect has it? What is the effect of sponge restoration on the Rhine discharge at Lobit in the Netherlands? And we looked at all this different type of scale when we modeled this sponge restoration. Next one, please. Well, we did, this was our pilot site in the model area, Steinebroek catchment in the upstream Kiel River, where we, in this light green areas, we restored the sponge habitat. And this site, we thought, okay, it's not possible to restore everything in common sense. So we just restored a couple of sites in our model, just to look at what is the effectiveness of sponge restoration. Next slide, please. Well, here you see the conclusion. From this modeling, and we see that on local scale, we have at a very local scale, we have 35% peak flow reduction. When we are at a discharge station of Steinebroek, which is a bit downstream, then we see that we still have a 13% discharge reduction. And it's all the way from the Mosel and the Rhine. We see already in the Netherlands that we have 2% of peak flow reduction that is possible if we restore around 38% of the existing areas of the existing sponge areas in the River Rhine. But it's good to emphasize they are very small areas. They are just areas where the water is collecting from the surrounding hills, and that makes it a very effective measure. It also increases base flow. As we saw also in the Steinebroek catchment, that immediately downstream, there's a much more steady water flow, which also is a good thing for the agriculture downstream. Next slide, please.
Jos, can you hear me?
Yeah.
You have 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. Well, this is also the water quality we modeled. It has positive effects on reduction of nitrogen and phosphorus downstream of this catchment area. That was one of our modeling results as well. So it has retention of nutrients. Next slide, please. Well, the overall benefits are ecosystem restoration. They have the potential to act like transition to nature corridors from one area to another. We see peak flow reduction, we see base flow increasement, water quality improvement in our models, and carbon storage, up to 20 ton CO2 reduction per acre per year. Next slide, please. We also made a cost-benefit analysis. Okay, what are the benefits and what are the costs avoided with those benefits, or the cost we have to make? And that you see in this slide, it's a first indication that we see that if we implement it, we have a positive social cost benefit analysis by implement sponge area. And most of the area lie in the carbon sink, so we can have CO2 storage, and also in avoided cost for peak flow and avoided cost for drought damage. Next slide, please. And then there was this flood event in July 2021, and this also in the Kiel River. And there we saw the first analysis that we make, that this social cost and financial cost, they are enormous. They are not just estimated, but you see that what kind of devastation this flood had downstream. Next slide, please. So we are busy in looking how this summer peak event, that's very different from the winter peak events, are building up. And we saw this enormously. You see that here in this upstream catchment area, which is very small, it delivers a quite high peak discharge, a very high peak discharge. And per square kilometer, we have a lot of peak discharge in this upstream catchment area. So they have macro effects, micro discharges, which causing problem downstream in this area. Upstream, there are not so much problems, but there the solution lies. There is the main problem occurs here in this upstream areas. And what we are trying to investigate is what is the water which is in this fast peak flow. So we need to know what is the build-up of the peak flow. How does it build up? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This one I skip. So we looked in all this upstream catchment where the water is coming from. We went to a field trip last week just to look. Okay, where does the water come from? Next slide, please. And we saw that there was limited contribution. Our first ideas was that there was limited contribution from very steep forest areas. There was not so much overland flow, just small gullies. And there were no signs of overland flow in this pasture areas, in this meadow areas. In this next slide, please. what we see that what was the fast component in the summer peak discharge seemed to be the paved and unpaved roads in the area. They were largely at erosion signs, and we are going back next week to determine this theory that it is the paved and unpaved roads that were building up this major catastrophe downstream. And that means that natural sponges can act also as a buffer close to roads to just buffer the water. Next slide, please. What we saw here is also this drainage systems, which I was talking about. Here my colleague is, and the water was up to here. We saw the erosion signs, and it delivered quite a lot of water, 5 cubes per second, which added to the peak flow and added to the damaging peak disaster downstream. So by making this a sponge area, we can prevent it from fast flowing area. We can transform it from a fast flowing area into a slow flowing area. Next slide, please. Now I'm almost finished. Because here we saw some natural sponge area on the left side in this upstream Kiel River catchment. Upstream of this area, there was water flowing on a fast track downwards, and it was just slowed down in this natural sponge area, which was just a small sponge area, but it was enough to slow down the fast streaming of water and preventing it from being being part of a flood disaster downstream. And also here we saw in an existing gully that there was a lot of obstruction in this river in a nature area here, which also causes a delay of water flowing downwards. Next slide, please. I'm almost, I think this is the last. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to the last slide because otherwise I take too much time. And next slide, please. Yeah, so the conclusion are that the restoration of natural retention areas is a viable ecosystem-based solution to improve the hydrological service of the catchment. It reduces flood risk and droughts in the Rhine Basin, and it has an effect on local levels and also on regional and international levels. And the more benefits, and it has other benefits taken well into account, for instance, CO2 sequestration. Next slide, please. Last one. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jos, and thank you for the words for Sir David Attenborough.
Yeah.
I would like to remember everyone that you can ask your questions in the chat for the people via YouTube. And I'm not sure if anyone in the audience at the moment has a concrete question right now. I see one. Please say your name.
Hello, my name is Sander van Andel from IUCN Netherlands. I'm wondering, for example, the example that you gave in the Kiel River catchment, if I heard it correctly, how large is the area that needs to be transformed, and what cost would that have? Because I mean, you saw, for example, in that area where there was this high flooding, that was agricultural area, and to buy out farmers, etc. Is there an economic estimation for such a catchment? How much land should be given back to nature anyway? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. We estimated in this modeling exercise, we estimated that we only need 100 acres of farming land because we can have that very strategically. On very strategic locations, we can implement the sponge areas. And it's different in Holland because you have large side effects when you we get a higher groundwater table. But in these hilly areas, the side effects are not totally present. So it's just the low-lying areas in these upstream catchments that you need to transform in wetland areas. So it's in our Steinebroek catchment, it was only 100 hectares that we should transform. Of this, in total, 48 square kilometers, the area was where we looked at. Of course, it costs money because you need to buy, or maybe not to buy, but you need to transform the land. And of course, this farmer is getting less money, and we estimated how much it would cost. And we estimate also the big problem here is that the costs, they have to be made upstream and the benefits are downstream. And you need one way to equalize that. And that's, I think, where policy and governments, German local governments, but not only German, we thought that it would be a European effort because we saw it in all kind of European river catchments. But you need a way, and that's with all transitions, that when the benefits are on a different place or different scale or than the costs, then you need a way to level this in this area. But of course, the farmers need to be compensated for less production, but it's not quite a big amount of money.
Okay, thank you for the question, Sander, and for the answer, Jos. And interesting that there's another example of necessity to work together on a European scale to solve this problem, but it seems doable, I think. I would love to go to the last speaker of the day, and that would be Glen Swainson, coming from the UK. He will explain us the situation in the Roudsey Reserve. Glen, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Welcome amongst us here. And you are Senior Reserve Manager within Natural England and responsible for this area. So we would love to hear your story about climate mitigation and adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Glen Swainson, as mentioned, and I'm a Senior Reserve Manager for Roudsey Wood and Mosses National Nature Reserve, which is in Cumbria in the north of England. So Natural England is the government agency that deals with wildlife and the environment in England. Next slide, please. So just giving you a bit of an overview of Roudsey Wood and Mosses National Nature Reserve. You can see the blue line is the outline of the reserve. It's a site of special scientific interest, which is a UK designation for its biodiversity, habitats and species. It's also a special area of conservation, SAC, which you'll be familiar with as a European designation, again for biodiversity. Part of the site is also in the Lake District National Park, which has also become a World Heritage Site recently. So we've got various different layers of designation on top of each other on the reserve. The NNR itself is around 400 hectares in size, with around 300 of those hectares being lowland raised bog, with peat depths of between 3 and 8 meters. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the rest of the presentation. But also at Roudsey, we've got about 85 hectares of ancient woodland. About half of that is coppice limestone woodland, which we manage for dolomites, but also some rare fritillary butterflies. And we also have some oak woodland as well, ancient oak woodland. There's a small area of salt marsh and mud flats, which borders the woodland and connects it to the Leven estuary on the western side of the reserve. So it's a really nice mix of different habitats and some really nice transitions between those different habitats. If you can move on to the next slide, please. So what was our issue at Roudsey? Roudsey sits in an area of high rainfall in the north of England. So over the last several thousand years, it's developed into lowland raised bog with deep peat deposits. But more recently in human history, there's been historic drainage and peat cutting of the bog, which has resulted in degraded drying peat, which has then allowed woody vegetation and trees to establish, which further exacerbates the problem and makes the peat even drier. So if you can see on the map on the left-hand side, which is just a map of one of the lowland raised bog areas within Roudsey, you can see those linear features, those ditches that have been cut across the surface of the moss to drain the moss at some time. And actually even between those, there's even more drains that link up those ditches. So it's really comprehensively, or it was comprehensively drained. and probably either for forestry, or maybe even they were going to mill that peat, as a resource. Fortunately, that didn't happen, and it was dedicated as a national nature reserve, and so we prevented that. But it did mean that all of that drainage was still in place. The aerial photograph on the right-hand side, which was probably taken about 15 years ago, shows that same area before restoration. So what you're seeing is lots of big mature pine trees in the middle of the bog, but also around the edges. And you can also make out some of those linear drainage features across the surface of the moss. We're lucky in the sense that the site hasn't been milled, and so we still had the intact peat surface, but it was very much degraded in terms of the drainage system. So we really wanted to try and restore that hydrology, because obviously degraded and drained peat is a CO2 emitter. Next slide, please. So what did we do? Well, with EU LIFE funding, which we were able to secure for Rowdsey, and also 2 other large lowland raised bog sites in the north of Cumbria, we were able to get the funding to try and restore the natural hydrology of these areas that had been damaged in the past by human intervention. So initially what we had to do was to actually remove quite a lot of the trees and the scrubby vegetation from the surface of the moss. So some of that was just by felling the trees and extracting them, either with machinery or using a technique called skylining, where you've got a big metal cable which sort of spans the moss, and you can hook up the trees and pull them off site. But some of the smaller scrubby vegetation, we're able to actually we're just able to flail it using big machines with kind of a rotary flail, and it would mulch the trees, the smaller trees in the scrub, and just leave it as a mulch on the surface of the peat. So that's the first stage, but then very soon after that, you've really got to try and tackle what's happening with the hydrology. And we did that by creating a series of interconnecting peat bunds, like little walls almost, to block the ditches and slow the flow of rainwater off the bog. So although the bunds aren't very high, they're like little like little peat walls. It's more the action of what's happening underneath that's really important. So they would dig a ditch down to about 1.5 meters. They would compact the peat, and then they would make a little bund on the top and put the vegetation back on, which is kind of what you can see on the right-hand side in the photograph. Also, a bit of a problem with a lot of the peatlands that we have in the north of England is they have a very hard edge. So you often have a cut peat face, which can be a couple of meters high. And then you tend to have a big drainage ditch on the edge of the peat bog. And then you're straight into intensively managed agricultural land. So it's quite important to be able to reprofile some of the cut peat edges. Otherwise, they tend to crack and slump, and you can get a lot of damage created that way. So just looking at the photograph on the right-hand side there, that was during restoration. So each one of those square cells is approximately 30 meters by 30 meters. And you can see how much water they're holding straight away. If you look in the very top right-hand corner of the photograph, it's just a little tiny dot, and that's actually a 15-ton digger working away at building the bunds. So it's really interesting that as soon as the cells have been created, what happens is they started to fill up, even though it wasn't raining at the time. And that's because the peat is basically under the ground, where it's been sort of compacted a little bit, is stopping the lateral flow of water through the peat, through cracks and peat pipes. And so it just brings it to the surface almost straight away, which is really incredible. Next slide, please. So again, this is just looking at the same area before and after. To the left-hand side, which was before restoration, you would see a lot more trees. You can see some of those linear features. And then afterwards, on the right-hand side, you can see that quite a lot of the trees have been removed or mulched. And also you can see that little grid pattern of bunds and kind of the cells that have created to try and keep water on the peat and to stop it flowing off as quickly. One of the things that obviously is important with peatlands is to keep them wet, because if we can get the hydrological conditions right, And basically you're getting peat forming again, which then means it's not emitting carbon dioxide, but it's actually taking it in. You know, it's sequestering carbon. Next, please. So just a couple more images taken from a drone, actually when the work was happening. So you can see again how much water is being held on the site simply by blocking those ditches and drains. And that was done more or less right at the time of restoration. But if we looked at that same image again now, which is 3 years later, you would hardly see any standing water because there's been a lot of colonization of sphagnum mosses and other bog vegetation. And actually the rigid grid pattern of bunds that you see through there almost disappears after a few years. It's quite incredible, actually. It's an amazing thing to see how quickly you can change the hydrology on these sites, and then also how quickly the vegetation responds. Next slide, please. So again, this was an image just taken, a photograph taken 6 months after that restoration that we're just looking at. And it was just a profusion of cotton grass, loads of sphagnum mosses starting to grow. You can see even in the foreground, a little bit of standing water. So if you can get the restoration right, although it's a big process and it can be quite expensive, the benefits to it are almost instantaneous, and you know it makes a huge difference in a very short space of time. Next slide, please. So although the hydrological restoration was primarily undertaken with biodiversity, the habitats and species in mind, we were really as equally as excited by the natural climate buffer benefits of the work. So, you know, using the NCB terminology for this site, obviously Rowdsey is a carbon sink, because if we can get that peat forming again, then it's sequestering carbon in the peat. But also it's acting as a natural sponge, which very similar to what Jos has been talking about in terms of slowing the flow of water. Next slide, please. So if we think about Rowdsey as a carbon sink, the restoration of the bog will lead to the protection of the current carbon stocks, which is really important because on a site like Rowdsey, where I mentioned we've got about 300 hectares of deep peat ranging from about 3 to 8 meters. That is a vast quantity of stored carbon. And actually, before the restoration, what we were finding is that it was a carbon emitter as a site. You know, apart from the issues with biodiversity, the fact that we've got this National Nature Reserve emitting carbon is not a great situation. But after restoring the living layer of the bog, so all of the vegetation which grows on the surface of the bog, it creates an active carbon sink, and flipping the system to being, you know, sequestering large amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. So if we look at this species here, sphagnum moss, which is one of the dominant species that you'd find on a lowland raised bog, it's, you know, it's photosynthesizing, it's drawing out carbon dioxide from the air. But because the site is very wet and quite acidic, and because of the sort of microbial action of the sphagnum itself, because it inhibits microbial action, then you tend not to get the plant material breaking down. So you're getting layer upon layer of accumulating plant material underneath the living layer. And the general rule of thumb is to say that peats tend to form at about 1 millimeter a year, which equates to about 1 meter per 1,000 years. So if you think about some of the deeper peats on Rowdsey, where it's 8 meters, that equates to about 8,000 years of continuous peat formation before it was damaged by human intervention. So it's a really incredible process, and there's not many habitats really that will store carbon continually in that way. We can have the next slide, please. But also we can think of the work that we've done on Rowdsey as a natural sponge as well. It's holding more water on the site and then discharging slowly, slowing the flow of water off the site downstream, which, you know, helps to prevent some of those bigger flooding events that Jos has been describing as well, where you're getting vast quantities of water suddenly going into the local river. So, projects like this can really help. It helps to reduce the erosion of peat and improves water quality on site as well. So before we had some quite deep, fast ditches coming off the bog, and actually you'd find that there was a lot of peat contained in those and actually getting washed into the local watercourse. So that's a big benefit. But also one of the sort of secondary benefits that we didn't think about too much, but which has been massive, is the huge reduction in the wildfire risk due to the removal of a lot of the trees and woody growth, which were on the degraded peat before, but also just resaturating the peat. So a couple of years ago, prior to the restoration happening, during the summer, especially in those really hot, dry summers that we're getting more frequently now, the vegetation would become quite crispy in midsummer. And we used to be quite concerned that you'd only take, a stray cigarette butt or even a lightning strike or something, and you could really have quite a serious wildfire across the surface of the bog. And dry peat burns extremely well. And because of the nature of the site that we've got, it's actually quite difficult to deal with wildfires on bogs. They're not easy to get to. So the fact that we've been able to mitigate some of those risks around wildfire is pretty huge, really, and also helps to preserve the habitat and means that we're not having to deal with those issues in the future, which is great. Next slide, please. So what next? Well, we're absolutely delighted with the work that we've been able to achieve through EU funding. One of the ongoing issues we've got is with rhododendron as a non-native invasive. It used to cover big areas of the moss. It's largely been eradicated now, but it's still able to regrow from cut stumps or from seed. So we've got to continue to spot spray with herbicide in the future just to keep on top of it. But I think more importantly now, we've also got to turn our focus to working with adjacent landowners around the National Nature Reserve to recreate the surrounding transitional habitats that would have certainly have been there at some point in its past. So I'm talking about things like fen or reed bed, wet woodland, and look at the kind of wider hydrological unit rather than just focusing in on the deep peat. Because as I mentioned before, with a lot of the peatlands, you tend to have a very hard edge, often a big ditch, and then you're straight into really intensively managed agriculture. So I think it's key for us to try and work with some of the landowners around the bog area and the nature reserve to try and buffer the sites, but also create some really important habitat, other wetland habitats, which will have their own benefits as well for biodiversity and some of the NCB characteristics that we've been talking about. Next slide, please. So yeah, this just last one is a raft spider, Dolomedes fimbriatus, which is one of our sort of key star species at Rowdsey. Huge spider, they sort of tend to scuttle around over the surface of the water in the bogs. I'm not really a spider person, but I think they're absolutely beautiful. So I just thought I'd just show you that image to finish with. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Glenn. That was a very nice story to hear from you, and a lot of good work you're doing over there in the UK. One very fast question: you told us you are sponsored by the European Union financially for restoration projects.
Yeah.
Will it be more difficult in the upcoming years after the Brexit to try to restore, or will you find other means to do so?
Yeah, well, it's a very big issue for us because the restoration of those 3 mosses was somewhere in the region of about, I think it's about £5 million. So a really big project, and that revenue stream has now largely dried up because we've left the EU. So it is a disaster really in a lot of ways. And we're going to have to look to see how we can restore our mosses and bogs in a different way. But yeah, it's a really big issue. And, that project started in 2014, finished in 2019, but that's not an option for us in the future. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Good luck there. I still remind you, people listening in via YouTube, you can ask questions in the chat. We have a little bit of time for discussion before we round off this session. Is there someone from within the audience who likes to ask a question right now? Yeah. You will have a microphone.
Okay.
Please say your name and ask the question. And
Okay, great. My name is Elizabeth Matioli. I'm from Kenya. Back in Kenya, I work with the Embassy of Denmark, and we support quite a wide range of programs, including programs on climate and resilience. So I actually had a question before Glenn presented, and it kind of got answered because I was just listening to you saying, you know, giving land back to nature, and I was trying to imagine practically what that means. So I really appreciate the explanation he has given there about the restoring the bog back in, I forget what, Cumbria or somewhere like that. Yeah, so I think that's really, really good. And my question was whether some of the initiatives, some of the technologies you're using out here, you know, in the UK with Glen and in the Netherlands, whether that is something that can easily be applied in places like Kenya, because in where we, Denmark has a very huge water project and rangeland management project in the northern part of Kenya. And essentially that's the part that we call the arid and semi-arid, very water scarce areas and prone to drought a lot and frequently also flooding. And what we have seen done a lot, we've proliferated a lot of this, what we call water pans. We do boreholes. And right now we are actually going into a partnership with World Bank. We're about to start to do a huge national project, which we are calling the Climate Action, Financing Locally Led Climate Action. And that's also going to do more work on water and flood mitigation and drought mitigation and all of that. So I was just wondering, here we are, we do water pans. That essentially means digging out, you know, huge areas of land and hoping that when it rains, water can be conserved there. And I was just wondering how practical some of these technologies you have shared here or methodologies can be for Kenya and a place like the arid parts of Kenya. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for your question. I'm looking at one of the four experts, maybe to maybe Glenn or Jos, if you can try to respond to this question. I don't know if you know the situation in Kenya, but the question is, can these ideas about climate mitigation and adaptation be transposed to Africa? Can someone of you say something about it? Glenn, if I may ask you first.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not an expert, especially in the situation in Kenya, but what I would say is that a lot of the technologies that we've developed to look at wetland restoration are fairly straightforward. They're not high tech, really. They're just essentially allowing the habitats to heal themselves with a bit of a helping hand from us. And I think wetland restoration is an issue right across the planet. It's not a European issue or an African issue or whatever. It's that all, you know, so many of the wetlands across the globe have been decimated through whether it's agriculture or drainage or whatever. And so I'm sure, even though you maybe couldn't directly take the techniques that we've used, for instance, in the north of England, where it's very wet and we've got different habitats, I think the fundamental concept of valuing and restoring our wetlands is something that all countries should be looking at because of the multiple benefits that you can get that we've been talking about today. So moving water around for agriculture is one thing, but actually looking at restoring ecosystems, I think you get multiple benefits, whether it's for people, for agriculture, for the environment and biodiversity. So I would definitely suggest, to try and think about that, if that helps.
Yeah, thank you. Paul, you want to add something? Paul Vertegaal from Natuurmonumenten, the Netherlands.
Yes, I agree with Glenn that actually working with natural climate buffers is working with some principles which turn out to have a different practice in different climate zones, but I think we can learn a lot of each other. I think one of the principles of natural climate buffers is giving space to water. Keeping it there where precipitation is falling, keep it as long as possible there. Well, the peat bogs of Glen are, of course, extreme example, and there is falling rain enough in England. In the example of Jos, it is the same, and there they don't try to retain it in a certain area, but in the small waters in the catchment area. So, and I think the example of the minister of Suriname, which is a tropical country, he has many problems to cope along the coast with the rising sea level, and they try to use mangroves for that. But you can in the Netherlands we use marshlands with lower vegetations. We also work with they call it sand motors. If a sediment is how do you call that, is supplied to the system or is present in the system, you have to organize something that current or wind can transport it and build up the land area so that it can cope the rising sea level. And I suppose some of these situations can be there in Kenya, but your country is large and I know about which regions you are talking. Maybe it's a good, if you want, we can brainstorm a bit about it after this workshop, for example. But there is also a colleague organization of the Climate Buffer Coalition, that is the foundation EcoShape. You write it just as you speak it, ecoshape.org, O-R-G. They also origin in Netherlands, but they have a very huge, a much larger network than we have internationally. And they are working on, also in the tropics, on mangroves and sand motors, etc. So if you visit their website, you can also find some experiences. They also have fact sheets, they are not here. But I'm sure that the principle of natural climate buffers is possible to use everywhere in the world.
Paul, can I add something, Paul, to your?
Yes, you can.
Well, I think I listened to the local Kenya circumstances. I'm of course not an expert on the local circumstances, but I can imagine though that where the precipitation is falling, if you are able to preserve it in the ground, under the ground, so it can infiltrate and add to the local groundwater table, then it also reduces enormously the evaporation. If you compare it to you store the large amount of rain in some lakes or ponds along the riverside. So that might be another benefit if we store the rainfall closely to where it's falling in the local areas.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, and I hope few of these principles can be applied in Kenya. Nature-based solutions or building with nature is very interesting for you, I think, as well. If I may ask some other person, if there's a question. The man behind the desk, the technical man has a question. It's Tom Welter from IUCN.
Hi, I'm Tom Welter, IUCN Netherlands. I have a question about the area that you are using for storing, for acting as a water sponge. Is there some kind of a minimum width for it? Because what I saw were quite large areas where you meet machines and things. And perhaps if you do every waterway that you can find and add a few meters for it, where you can more or less do its own thing just by not hindering it. Perhaps it's easier to do and you can also reach the landmass, but I was just wondering if that's an idea at all.
I'm just checking. Is the question? I think the question is for Jos, maybe at this stage. Is the question understood?
I think so. I'm trying to get the point of the question, but well, what actually is the like Glenn said also, it's low technical solution. So it's what we are looking at is a landscape which naturally would not have been a riverside, would not have been a part of a river catchment area of the fast flowing part of it. So by human activity, we enlarge these river catchments, and by by bringing it back to its natural proportions. And that, I mean that the nature itself has the power to form a riverbed. That's where naturally the river is starting. But we enlarge these systems everywhere by human activity. So it's a very easy boundary that the nature is forming its riverbed itself by the power of the flowing water. By just let the nature decides where the riverbed is flowing, we bring it back into a natural situation where natural processes are shaping the start of the river. And what you get then instead of the enlarged river catchments is just swampy areas where when there's a lot of precipitation, it's getting wetter and wetter, and it's flowing through rough vegetation. And when it's drier, you get some kind of a bit of dry swampy area. But that's so it's a natural process to give it back to nature actually. And it's the scale of it can be very small actually. It can be just 30 meters wide, but it can stretch for a very long for a very long distance, and that makes it kind of instead of what Glen showed us, like this peat area, which was quite large scale. These are small scale areas in width, but in length they are quite large actually. They can go on for many kilometers.
Yep.
I don't know if that's the answer of the question. Huh?
Yeah, I get a thumbs up
okay.
here, so it's good. Thank you, Jos. I think we only have time for one last question. Is there someone within the audience? I have Sander? Yeah.
Yes, thank you for all the interesting presentations. I'm wondering, Glen, you showed at the end the spider, and I'm fascinated by that because you, in all the presentations, different scenarios were mentioned, but the biodiversity benefit, basically, maybe a very short final reflection on that would be interesting.
Yeah, Glen.
Yeah, I mean, I could have done a whole different presentation just on the biodiversity, and that's probably in some ways, you know, what's just, it's as equally as exciting. But I think in terms of what we've seen after the restoration at Raudsee, just an explosion of biodiversity, and not just biodiversity, but biomass as well. So when you find that when you get sites wetter, and the first year, for instance, is just thousands and thousands of dragonflies. And then you would get things like hobbies coming in to predate on the dragonflies. We had loads of wildfowl using those little pools while the water's still there. And then you get peregrines, and then we've got breeding osprey. You know, it's just an amazing site really for so many things, you know, whether it's invertebrates, whether it's amphibians, whether it's mammals. But I think, you know, when you have sites where the hydrology is working properly, you can see that you get an explosion of biodiversity. It's just amazing. And obviously this site that we've restored, it's still in transition. We say that we've restored it, but really we've just put the building blocks in place for it to restore itself over the next 10, 20, 30 years, whatever. But actually nature will always take advantage of those opportunities as they come along. You know, so whether we've got standing open water or whether we've got you know, dying trees, whatever. So yeah, it's been amazing, and it's been a really exciting opportunity to see how quickly nature will respond if you can get the conditions right.
Thank you very much, Glen. And I think the answer is fully understood. Yeah, thank you. I have one last question from the chat, which I want to ask to Jeffrey from BirdLife the Netherlands. And the question is, because we want to learn here also a bit in this session about struggles we have. Can you come over, Jeffrey? Oh, you can stand there. Yeah. What kind of blockades and difficulties we have when we want to work with nature-based solutions? And the question is, are the different government types, national, regional, and local, as well as different sectors, economical sectors, fit for the integrated approach you want to reach? It's a very broad question.
Yes.
But maybe you can give us a little highlight of the experience you have.
Yeah. a very good question. In its current form, I would say no. Although there have been a lot of nice results already also with the current organizational structures of governments. But I think, especially with this integral approach, yeah, we really need to cooperate more. And yeah, maybe because of these different ministries, they all have different pots of money. They all have different responsibilities, different objectives. And oftentimes the objectives that we want to achieve with our natural climate buffers are, per definition, cross-cutting all the different objectives from the ministries. And it is a very big barrier that we experience in actually implementing natural climate buffers on scaling them up, actually, because we need the different ministries to work together, and that sometimes is a bureaucratic process. And so I think that's the main barrier that we achieve, so that we see and we experience, and there is a lot of improvements to be made. And that is also why we want them to become mainstream, so that if, for example, the national government wants to implement climate adaptation measures, if we can manage to make these natural climate buffers mainstream and make them actually the first measure of choice, we first see how can we do this in a nature inclusive way. And if we can't, then we can see what technological solutions can aid to achieve the objectives that we foresee. And so by making it mainstream, we actually force these ministries and different organizational structures of the government to work together more than they do now. So yeah, good question. And can I also make a quick remark also on the question that Sander posed just now?
Yep.
About the biodiversity aspect? A very good question, and a very, we didn't talk much about the different species, for example, that really benefit from these natural climate buffers. I also believe that this, at BirdLife the Netherlands, we have been working on a concept that is called a basic quality for nature, where we see throughout the years that a lot of common species are also disappearing. So usually in nature, in protected areas, we're focusing on keeping the rare species there and preventing extinctions, but also restoring natural processes and giving space actually to nature, to natural climate buffers, also increases room for these common species, because now common species we also see decreasing trends. And to turn that around, also these common species are given more space, and this is this idea of this basic quality for nature. So also in that sense, there's a very strong benefit for biodiversity.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeffrey. Can I have the last slide, please? And then just rest me to thank you very much for listening to this session, to these European examples. For me, they show that there are a lot of common principles in this nature-based solutions, and that nature-based solutions should be as Jeffrey said, the first way to think about issues at landscape scale. And I think on the European scale, there are some real habitats that needs cooperations of European organizations together. So, for example, coastal areas, peatland restoration work, river systems. We cannot enter them only on a national level. We need to work together on an international scale. And would love to see in the future working together with Africa, Kenya would be nice. So, if you still have questions, please remember this session is recorded, will be available through YouTube. You can send in your final questions or ideas to info.eurosite.org. And well, then last, I want to thank the speakers, Jeffrey from BirdLife the Netherlands, Jeffrey Brandt, Paul Vettergaal from Natuurmonumenten, Glen Swainson from Natural England, and Jos de Bel from Bureau Stroming, for their very clear presentations. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye.